Hello, and welcome to the Driven Wheel podcast. Today we're going to be talking about my own personal car, which is a Lotus Europa Series 2. I want to talk about why I bought it, what I use it for, and then I want to introduce an article on what it's actually like to drive. So, I bought the car because, to be honest with you, I've always dreamed of owning one. It's a car which, when I was growing up, I wanted to experience. I love the way it looks. I love how I was told it drove. I love the fact that it's a Lotus and that it's made in the UK. I love how simple it is. And I quite like the quirkiness as well. I like the fact that it's got this Renault engine and this Renault transaxle, and that Colin Chapman essentially outsourced that part of it to make sure the car was generally reliable. I use the car for, pretty much everything. I have used it for work, even. I can get saws and tools in it. But I think the important things that I've used it for are long trips away. It's been to the south of France, and I've taken it surfing there. It travelled down with surfboards on the roof. It's very, very good for long road trips, as long as you're tolerant of the fact that you get very warm inside it, and it doesn't have a huge fuel range, so you do need to top it up quite often. But it's such a special car. It always gets attention, but not in a bad way. When you drive something really showy and expensive, the attention you get is very different. You get people essentially looking at you like you're a bit of a dick. With this, you get curiosity. People are just interested in the car and what it represents. It's also done things like, I've been to Le Mans in it, it's been up to Scotland, it's been up to Cumbria, it's been all over the UK. I've done tens of thousands of miles in this car, and yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through an article that I've written about what it's like to drive, and hopefully that should give you a bit more of an insight into what it's like to own one of these things. Right then, so let's talk about what these cars are actually like to drive. So, a Europa in good fettle requires concentration. Even when they're right, there can be little buggers on the limit. The steering is really quick and they're keen to turn in. As standard, they're unstable, which is pretty unusual for any car. With practice, you can make all four wheels slide, and you can revel in this. Driving quickly, there's little to no understeer, and unlike most cars, more throttle makes the front bite harder and will start to bring the rear around. If you lift at this point, it really will try and put you in a hedge, and in the wet, this is magnified. Wet weather and the light weight of the front end means they aquaplane, especially when you fit wide tyres. Make no mistake, these can be nasty cars, but when they're sorted and on the right road or track, they're pretty unique. They can pull over 1G cornering on cross-ply tyres, and the speeds you can enter corners take some adjustment. They are more than capable of being driven slowly too, and apart from a tendency to follow lorry ruts, are pretty relaxing to do so. You can cover large distances in decent comfort, and with some sound deadening, they're not too noisy either. Driving really is what these cars are about, and they present a challenge to do so well. In a decade, I wouldn't claim to have mastered it, but here are my thoughts regardless. The Europa has some interesting quirks. On standard suspension at least, they have a curious trait of the front turning in and then the rear following fractionally later. This is quite unsettling until you get used to it, and it seems a product of its geometry and rear suspension design. Suspension travel itself is quite limited, meaning on bumpy roads it's quite easy to use all of it. But the ride is good for a sports car. Its compliance makes it relaxing, and the steering effort overall is light. The steering is also unassisted, fast and direct. It is a very easy car to overcorrect when it starts to slide. you really do want to keep your inputs to an absolute minimum if you want to stay on top of it. When you drive it quickly, you have to be very measured with that steering input. On fast roads or track, you really rarely need more than a quarter turn of lock. You want to actively chase the throttle through the corner with the car loaded up. Corner speeds when doing this are very high. It doesn't have the power for slow in, fast out driving, so maintaining momentum is the way to go. Oversteering corners is more often a case of having lifted off and shifted the weight away from the rear rather than overpowering those back tyres. It responds really well to trail braking, and if you want all four wheels to slide consistently, then this is the best way of achieving it. It's important to emphasise the care needed when trail braking. The car does want to rotate, and it needs careful managing to ensure it stays settled. Over bumpy tarmac, it simply doesn't have the suspension travel to be driven like this, unless you go for a stiffer spring rate and all the compromises that are associated with that. Now, poor gear changes in these cars are really well documented. Even when everything is renewed, they're not positive in a traditional sense. Hurrying the gears can result in beating the synchros, so mechanical sympathy goes a long way. Learning where the gears are is also important in Europa. The gate just feels different to most other cars, and it's not very well defined. With practice, fast gear changes are possible, but only relative to the period the car was made. If you drive a modern manual gearbox, it's a robust joy in comparison. The pedal box is really tight in these cars. People with feet over size 10 really can struggle. Most cars, you brake with the sole of your foot, but in these, the pedals are so close, you need to use your toes. I use the side of my foot to heel and toe, and when used to the size constraints, it's no more difficult than any other car. There is no rest for your clutch foot, so on longer journeys, I alternate between bringing up my left knee and resting it on the centre console, or sometimes just hooking my foot below the clutch assembly. If you're over 1.8 metres, then you need to try driving one to make sure you fit before buying. The cabin is snug, and the seats are adjustable, but they don't go back that far. The clutch is light, but you can't pivot your foot using your heel like a normal car. Instead, you have to use your toes, which at first makes pulling off a challenge, but you do get used to it. Now, the Renault engine cars, as standard, do feel underpowered. They still have a decent top speed because of the low drag coefficient, but they're always working hard. Engine swaps to more modern Renault crossflow units are very commonly done, and I've done it in mine. Unlike most classics, not having the original engine doesn't have a detrimental effect on the value. A crossflow swap car is much more powerful, and it's fast enough to work the chassis properly. Anything over 120 horsepower is fast enough in one of these, coupled with the car's lightweight, to make them fun. Lotus twin cam cars are powerful enough as standard, but you can always tune them for more if you desire. Aerodynamically, Lotus put a lot of effort into creating a slippery shape. This is great for getting a high top speed with a low power engine, but it also makes them good on fuel. However, when fitted with something more powerful, they have an even higher top speed, and they do start to get unstable. The top speed of mine should be somewhere in the 130 mile an hour region, but honestly, anything over 120 and it's starting to lift the front end and get genuinely unstable. Lotus themselves recognised this, and they actually fitted a splitter to the twin cams to resolve it. It's probably worth doing if you want to run at high speeds consistently. Again, high-speed braking is going to make the car move around. The degree to which it does this is dependent on fuel load, luggage, weight of driver and passenger, and just how hard you're braking. Although I've never done it, I do suspect it's entirely possible to spin one in a straight line by braking hard. They really are lively on the brakes. Don't underestimate that. So, there are several issues with owning one of these, and one of them is the rear hubs and how they critically affect the stability of the car. Driven normally, the bearings last about 20,000 miles, but driven hard, this can decrease considerably. The hub splines wear, as does the hub itself, and when this happens, you get play in either of the rear wheels, and this makes it bloody dangerous. Depending on how bad the play is governs how unstable the car gets, and when it gets really bad, they really do oversteer in a straight line. Part of the problem is that if you drive the car regularly, you get used to the instability, and you start to ignore it, but you really shouldn't. You want to keep on top of it, and checking the rear wheels regularly will stop you from spearing the car through a hedge. On the right piece of tarmac, on the right day, this is a very, very special car. To drive, it's capable of going down a road with a finesse and delicacy uncommon to most other cars. What it felt like to drive one of these in the 60s, I can only guess, but it must have been pretty spectacular. If you want challenging, rewarding, and deeply flawed, then perhaps you should consider one. I've had mine for a decade and driven it in some totally unsuitable situations. It's been reliable by 60s Lotus standards, and I cannot for the life of me think what I could replace it with. The journeys, memories, and yes, its imperfections add up to something extraordinary. It's enough to make an unsentimental man, sentimental. I hope you enjoyed listening to this, the first of the Driven Wheel podcasts. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.